This is the story of the 6 months that a great many historians call the turning point of the Pacific War, and of the quieter argument, never fully settled, over whether that title truly belongs to Guadalcanal at all. Between the 7th of August 1942 and the 9th of February 1943, the United States and the Empire of Japan poured men, warships, and aircraft into a fight for one malarial island in the Solomons until one side could no longer replace what it was losing. That last phrase holds the whole campaign in a sentence. No single brilliant stroke won Guadalcanal. Victory came the way a long war of exhaustion always arrives, going to the side that could still put a fresh ship in the water, a fresh squadron in the air, and a fed soldier in the line after the other side had run dry. Hold on to that idea, because almost everything the popular memory hands you about this campaign, the heroic last stands, the banzai charges, the tide turning in one shining moment, sits uneasily on top of a colder truth. The Americans lost or drew most of the surface sea battles fought at Guadalcanal, and they won the campaign regardless. Understanding how that could happen means starting not with the fighting but with the map, and with a decision made thousands of miles away that the Pacific could wait. Guadalcanal made a small place to carry so much weight. 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, the island rises inland to mountains near 8,000 feet, its coast wrapped in jungle so hot and so wet that disease turned into a combatant in its own right, fighting on both sides and taking no prisoners. In the ordinary run of a world war, no one would have spent a life on it. A single feature made Guadalcanal matter, and that feature was an airfield. Through the middle of 1942, Japanese forces began carving an airstrip near Lunga Point, on the island's northern coast. An airfield there threatened the sea lane between the United States and Australia, the long supply artery running about 1,200 miles to the northeast, the line that kept an entire theatre of the war alive. An airfield on Guadalcanal amounted to a knife held near that artery, which meant that a piece of ground worth nothing on its own suddenly meant everything, purely because of what could fly off it. The American answer took the form of an offensive the war's own strategy was never supposed to permit. The Allied Grand Plan went by the name Germany First, the agreement that the war against Germany took priority, and that the Pacific would be held on a shoestring until Europe was settled. Guadalcanal became the first major Allied ground offensive of the Pacific War, and it cut directly against the grain of that plan. The operation carried the code name Watchtower, though the men who fought it coined a truer name for it, Operation Shoestring. Command was asking them to seize the initiative in the wrong theatre, using resources the strategy had earmarked for somewhere else. Here is the first place the standard story bends. We remember Guadalcanal as the moment America went on the offensive, bold, deliberate, the opening of the long road to Tokyo. In truth, the offensive amounted to a gamble launched into a theatre headquarters had already written off as secondary, and for most of the 6 months that followed, the men on and around that island fought knowing the main effort lay elsewhere. The story of Guadalcanal is not one of overwhelming force arriving to crush a weaker enemy. It is the story of a thin, improvised, under-resourced effort that came very close to failing, and that finally succeeded less through its own strength than through the enemy's inability to finish it. On the 7th of August 1942, the 1st American Marines went ashore. Some 6,000 men of the 1st Marine Division came ashore against roughly 2,000 Japanese defenders, spread across Guadalcanal and the smaller islands nearby, Tulagi, Gavutu, Tanambogo, and Florida. The landings on the main island met little of the resistance the Marines had braced for, and the great prize, that half-built airfield, fell into American hands almost without a fight. The Americans finished what the Japanese had started, completing the airstrip and naming it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed 2 months earlier at the Battle of Midway. That name matters, because it ties this campaign to the one just before it, and to the argument we will return to at the end, the argument over which of those two battles, Midway or Guadalcanal, truly turned the war. Guadalcanal carried an Allied code name of its own, Cactus, and from that name came the Cactus Air Force, the improvised collection of Marine, Navy, and Army air power that flew out of Henderson Field from around the 20th of August. This force never stayed purely American. Royal New Zealand Air Force elements flew alongside it, one of the threads of Commonwealth participation running quietly through the campaign. The Cactus Air Force would become the single reason the American position on the island survived at all, and it created the strange, split rhythm that defined the fighting. That rhythm ranks among the strangest features of the entire campaign. By day, American aircraft flying from Henderson Field ruled the waters around Guadalcanal. No Japanese ship wanted to be caught in those waters in daylight. Once night fell and the American planes could no longer fly, Japanese warships owned that same water. They ran down the channel the Americans called the slot, delivered troops and supplies in fast night dashes, and vanished before dawn. The Americans named these night runs the Tokyo Express, while the Japanese called the very same thing rat transportation, a quick furtive movement through the dark. Consider what that arrangement really meant. Two great navies were time-sharing a single stretch of sea, each dominant only inside its own window, neither able to hold it around the clock. It is a pattern you can find far outside of war. It mirrors the pattern of two rival operators forced to share one piece of contested infrastructure on opposite shifts, one service running the line by day, a competitor running the same line by night, each supreme in its own hours and helpless in the others. The whole Guadalcanal campaign played out inside that shift change, the daylight belonging to Henderson Field, the darkness belonging to the Tokyo Express, and the deciding question being which side would first stretch its shift around the clock. The Marines had landed and the airfield belonged to them, and then, on the very first night, the campaign delivered the first of its catastrophes and the first of its lasting controversies. Making sense of it means knowing where the American carriers had gone, and the carriers covering the landing answered to Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. On the 8th of August, the day after the landings, Fletcher withdrew his carriers from the immediate area, citing the risk to his irreplaceable flight decks and the state of his fuel. Within hours of that withdrawal, in the black early morning of the 9th of August, a Japanese cruiser force fell on the Allied screening ships in the waters off Savo Island. What followed ranks among the worst defeats in the history of the United States Navy in open water. In a savage close-range night action, remembered as the worst 37 minutes the Navy had ever fought, the Allies lost 4 heavy cruisers. 3 of them flew American colors, the Quincy, the Astoria, and the Vincennes. The 4th, the Australian Canberra, took such punishment that her own side had to scuttle her. That single action drowned or burned more than 1,000 American sailors, along with 84 Australians. The Japanese force lost around 130 men and sailed away all but untouched. This stretch of water between Guadalcanal, Savo, and the islands to the north had carried the name Savo Sound. After Savo Island, and after everything that came later, the sailors gave it the name it still carries, Iron Bottom Sound, for the sheer density of sunken steel and drowned men it would come to hold. The naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison would write that you could search the 7 seas in vain for an ocean graveyard holding the bones of so many ships and sailors as that one narrow sound. With the carriers gone and the screen shattered, the American transports could not linger, and they pulled out before they had finished unloading, leaving the Marines ashore with only part of their supplies. For a time the men on the island stood effectively abandoned, holding a captured airfield, digging in, living partly on captured Japanese rice, waiting for a navy that had just been mauled. The Marines never forgot it, and they coined a bitter decoration for the occasion, the George Medal, a sarcastic emblem of being left to hold the bag while the Navy sailed away. The resentment between the services was real, and it had a name, and that name was Frank Jack Fletcher. Here the campaign reaches one of its real, unresolved arguments, the kind of dispute a serious history has to present as a live question rather than a settled verdict. For decades, the dominant judgment on Fletcher was harsh. Morison, whose accounts shape how generations understood the naval war, painted Fletcher's withdrawal as something close to cowardice, a commander who ran and left the Marines exposed. That was the received wisdom, and for a long time it stood. That received wisdom has since been challenged, and challenged with sources. The historian John Lundstrom, in his study Black Shoe Carrier Admiral, re-examined the decision using the information Fletcher truly had in the moment he made it, and concluded that the withdrawal stood far more defensible than its critics allowed, a prudent call given what Fletcher knew, not a failure of nerve. In Lundstrom's reading, more of the blame for the Marines' plight belongs to the amphibious commander, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, and to the breakdown in communication over how the unloading was really progressing. Fletcher, in this view, has spent decades wearing a reputation he did not entirely earn. Notice what has happened here. One set of facts, a carrier withdrawal, a massacre off Savo, stranded Marines, supports two opposed judgments depending on which historian holds the evidence. That disagreement is not a flaw in the history. It is the history. It also gives the first sign of something this campaign keeps teaching, that Guadalcanal lives in memory as clean moral outlines while the record underneath stays anything but clean. Picture the American position in the weeks after Savo. The Marines held a perimeter around Henderson Field, the Navy had been driven off, and the transports were gone. The Japanese, recovering from their surprise, set about the obvious thing, sending troops to take the airfield back. Every major land battle of the Guadalcanal campaign amounts, at bottom, to a variation on one objective, because the Japanese wanted Henderson Field, the Americans meant to keep it, and everything else is detail. Yet the detail is where the real lesson lives, in how the Japanese went about it. The first attempt came on the 21st of August, at a watercourse the Marines knew as Alligator Creek, on maps sometimes called the Ilu, in the action remembered as the Battle of the Tenaru. A Japanese force under Colonel Ichiki launched a night frontal assault against the Marine line. It ended as a disaster for the attackers. 789 men died out of the roughly 917 in the first element of Ichiki's detachment. The assault broke almost completely. One name attached to that battle deserves to be spoken, because it belongs to a man the standard account often leaves out. Before the attack, an islander named Jacob Vuza, a Solomon Islander scout working with the Coast Watchers, that thin network of observers feeding the Allies' warning of Japanese movements, fell into the hands of Ichiki's men while scouting. Tortured and left for dead, Vuza survived, reached American lines, and carried warning of the attack in time. The defense of that perimeter counted as more than a Marine achievement, resting in part on a network of local scouts whose names rarely reach the documentaries, and Jacob Vuza is the one whose name should. The second attempt came in the middle of September, on a ridge south of the airfield, in the battle remembered as Edson's Ridge, or, more vividly, Bloody Ridge. A Japanese brigade under General Kawaguchi threw itself at the high ground guarding the approach to Henderson Field, and a single Marine battalion held that ridge through the worst of it, standing between the Japanese and the airstrip. The attack failed, and then came a series of grinding actions around the Matanikau River through September and October, the kind of fighting that yields few clean victories and a steady, wearing toll. Step back and look at the shape of these attacks, because here the second great myth of Guadalcanal falls apart. Popular memory casts the Japanese soldier here as the fanatic, the banzai charge, the refusal to surrender, the death before Dishina. That image is not invented, since the frontal night assaults were real, and they were often suicidal. Even so, fanaticism is not why the Japanese lost the land battle. They lost it because they fed their strength into the fight one piece at a time. First came Ichiki's detachment, which was destroyed, then Kawaguchi's brigade, which was thrown back, and only later did a full division follow. Each force went in before the next arrived, and each met defeat in its turn, beaten in detail, one after another, because the Japanese command kept underestimating how many Americans were dug in around that airfield and kept sending too little, too late. It ranks among the oldest ways to lose a battle, never concentrating enough force in one place at one time to win it. That failure has a modern name, and it lives far from any battlefield. In the study of how organizations make decisions, it goes by the name escalation of commitment, the trap of pouring more resources into a failing course of action by increments, each one too small to turn the situation and too large to abandon, until everything has gone piecemeal into a position you could never have taken all at once. The Japanese on Guadalcanal did not lose the land war to American heroism alone. They lost it the way a company loses a doomed project it cannot bring itself to cancel, a little more, and a little more, and a little more, until nothing remained to send. While the ground war ground on, the thing keeping the American position alive was flying out of Henderson Field. The Cactus Air Force never grew large and never grew comfortable. It operated from a single vulnerable airstrip, under bombardment, at the end of a supply line that barely functioned. Yet it stood as the reason the Tokyo Express had to run at night, the reason Japanese ships feared the daylight, the reason the Marines on the ground were never simply overrun from the sea. Names came out of that air war that marine aviation would carry for the rest of its history. Joe Foss, credited with 26 aerial victories, along with John L. Smith and Marion Carl. They flew from a strip of pierced steel and coral in the middle of a contested ocean, and they held the sky over the island in the hours when holding it mattered. Here a pattern begins that would decide the entire campaign, though almost no one fighting it could yet see the whole of it. The air war, like the sea war, ran as an attrition machine. Every day the Cactus Air Force flew, aircraft went down and aircrew died on both sides. The Japanese, flying from distant bases, bled trained pilots into these skies at a rate they had never planned for and could not sustain. That bleeding would not reveal its full weight until much later, though it was already running, every single day, in the sky over that one airfield. By October, the campaign had turned into a slugfest, a straight exchange of men, ships, and aircraft, with no clear winner and no clear end. That kind of contest was precisely the kind Japan, the poorer and smaller industrial power, could least afford. Two sides trading losses evenly is not an even contest when one side can replace its losses and the other cannot. On the American side, that pressure produced a change of command. In October, Admiral Chester Nimitz relieved the commander of the South Pacific area, Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, and replaced him with Vice Admiral William Halsey. The effect on morale landed immediately, since Halsey's reputation for aggression lifted the men at a moment when the campaign hung by a thread. Nimitz, at the same time, was quietly running a series of large risks, stripping other areas of the Pacific, including Hawaii, of forces to feed the fight for this one island. Aggression cuts both ways, and that deserves an honest hearing rather than a smoothing over. The same Halsey whose fighting spirit revived the campaign also pushed his last two aircraft carriers into a battle at the Santa Cruz Islands on the 26th of October. That cost him the carrier Hornet and left the Enterprise damaged. Halsey lifted morale, and Halsey also lurched from bold to rash, and the record holds both of those truths at once. Command at Guadalcanal never amounted to a gallery of flawless heroes making perfect calls. It came down to a set of exhausted men making high-stakes decisions on bad information and getting some of them wrong. The land side of that October crisis came at the same time, in the battle for Henderson Field, fought from the 23rd to the 26th of October, when a full Japanese division at last made its major bid for the airfield. It failed like the others before it, and it failed expensively, with American losses in that action running somewhere between 61 and 86 killed, while the Japanese attackers lost on the order of 2,000 to 3,000. Read those two numbers side by side and you can see the whole shape of the land war, an attacker throwing mass against a prepared defense and paying a ruinous price for ground it could not hold. The campaign's true climax came at sea, in November, in the action remembered as the naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought across the nights of the 12th through the 15th. This marked the crisis point. The Japanese were trying to force warships through to shell Henderson Field into uselessness and to run a major reinforcement to the island. An American force stood in the way, and what happened when they met was the bloodiest surface fighting of the campaign. In the close-range chaos of the first night, two American admirals, Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, were killed in the same action. They remain the only two United States Navy flag officers killed in a surface engagement in the whole of the Second World War. The first night alone cost the Americans 1,439 men, Well over 1,000 sailors lost in that one action. The Americans lost cruisers, among them the Atlanta and the Juno. Across those same nights, the Japanese lost something they could neither replace nor afford to spend: battleships. 2 of them, the High A and the Kirishima, went down in the fighting for that stretch of water. More important still, the Japanese failed to do the thing they had come to do. They did not knock out Henderson Field, and they did not get their reinforcement through intact. In the ledger that truly mattered, it stood as an American strategic result, bought at a horrifying tactical price. At the very end of November, the campaign delivered one last lesson in humility. On the 30th, at the Battle of Tassafaronga, a smaller Japanese destroyer force under Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka met an American cruiser force at night and handled it brutally, sinking the cruiser Northampton and crippling 3 more cruisers, a sharp tactical defeat delivered inside a campaign the Americans were, by then, winning. Sit with that for a moment, because it captures the single most important thing to understand about Guadalcanal at sea. Savo Island brought an American disaster. Santa Cruz brought a Japanese tactical win that cost the Americans a carrier, and Tassafaronga brought an American mauling. The Americans lost or drew a striking number of the individual surface actions around this island. The place was called Iron Bottom Sound for a reason, and a great deal of that iron was American, and the Americans won the campaign even so. The explanation for how the losing side of so many battles won the campaign separates the real history of Guadalcanal from the highlight reel, and it does not come down to a battle at all. It comes down to a rate. Consider what those sea fights were really doing. Both navies were pouring warships and aircraft into one small arena and destroying them at a furious pace. By the end of the campaign, the common tally has each navy losing around 24 major warships, an almost even exchange of destroyed ships. On the surface, that looks like an even trade. An even exchange, though, spells catastrophe for the side that cannot rebuild. The United States could lay down new hulls, train new crews, and send new squadrons at a pace the Empire of Japan could not begin to match. Japan could win the battle off Tassafaronga and still lose the War of the Sound, because winning a night action does not put a new destroyer in the water or a new trained aircrew in the cockpit. It only spends the ones you have. This runs as the deepest cross-current in the whole story, and it reframes everything. Guadalcanal was decided not by who fought better, but by who could still afford the fight after 6 months of it. That is not a military idea at all. It is an economic one. It comes down to the difference between the balance in an account on any given day and the rate at which that account refills. A rival can beat you in the individual transactions, can win quarter after quarter, and still go under, if their reserves are draining faster than they can replace them while yours refill overnight. Japan was winning battles and losing its balance sheet. The Cactus Air Force kept bleeding Japanese aircrew that Japan could not retrain in time, and the Sound kept swallowing Japanese destroyers that Japan could not rebuild. The Americans were losing ships and men too, often more of them in many of the fights, yet they were spending from reserves that could be replenished, and their enemy could not. That is why the men who lost so many of the battles won the campaign, not because they fought better on any given night, but because they could still be there on the next one. Nowhere does that logic show its face more terribly than in what happened to the Japanese soldier on the ground. The Tokyo Express could do one thing well, running troops to Guadalcanal in fast night dashes. What it could not do was sustain them. Fast destroyers moving in the dark could deliver men, but they could not deliver the steady flood of food and supply that an army in the field consumes. The result was that the Japanese force on Guadalcanal, reinforced piece by piece across the campaign, began to starve inside a position it was still, on paper, trying to hold. The Japanese have their own name for Guadalcanal, and it is not a name of glory. They call it Gatu, which means Starvation Island. By the end of the campaign, the majority of Japanese deaths on Guadalcanal were not caused by American fire at all. They came from starvation and from disease, from malaria and dysentery and hunger in the jungle. The soldiers on the island worked out a grim arithmetic of their own survival. measuring how long a man had left to live by whether he could still rise to his feet. The men who could still stand had the most time left, while the men who could not were already counting down. By late December, the reality had become undeniable even to the high command in Tokyo. A message came off the island from the commander of the 17th Army, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, reporting that there was no food, that scouting was no longer possible, that the army could no longer resist the American advance, and asking permission for his men to die attacking the enemy rather than starve to death in their own dugouts. You will often hear that each navy lost 24 warships, and that is the tally of major warships alone. Count in the auxiliaries and transports, and the numbers climb to something closer to 29 ships lost on the American side and 38 on the Japanese. Modern survey work in the Sound, mapping the wrecks with deep water vehicles, has put the total loss across the whole campaign at more than 111 vessels and around 1,450 aircraft, with more than 20,000 lives lost beneath and above that one stretch of water. The number you cite depends entirely on what you are counting, major warships or everything that sank, which is exactly why a number without a definition attached is not a fact. It is a decoration. For a Canadian audience, the honest place to begin is with how little Canada figured in a campaign like this one, because Canada was barely here at all, and saying so plainly matters more than manufacturing a connection that never existed. There was no Canadian unit at Guadalcanal. Canada's Pacific fighting in 1942 was unfolding somewhere else entirely, in the cold of the Aleutians, off Alaska, where Royal Canadian Air Force Squadron and Royal Canadian Navy warships joined a very different campaign against the Japanese, one in which they made almost no direct contact with the enemy at all. The Solomons were an American fight, with a Commonwealth thread supplied mainly by New Zealand airmen, not Canadian ones. One man, though, deserves naming here, precisely because the temptation is to overclaim him. That man was Douglas Munro. Born in Vancouver, British Columbia, in 1919, Munro died on the 27th of September 1942 on Guadalcanal, in the fighting along the Matanikau, covering the withdrawal of Marines under fire. Douglas Munro remains the only member of the United States Coast Guard ever to receive the Medal of Honor. The honest caveat has to be spoken in the same breath as the honor, that Munro was Canadian by birthplace but served under American colors, raised across the border, an American serviceman by every measure except the town where he was born. He forms a real thread between this island and Canada, yet he is not evidence of Canadian participation. He was one Vancouver-born man who died wearing another country's uniform, and the accurate way to remember him is exactly that, no more and no less. The deeper Canadian connection to Guadalcanal is not a soldier on the island at all, but the very thing that won the campaign. Guadalcanal was decided by industrial capacity, by the ability of the Allied economies to replace what the fighting destroyed faster than the enemy could. That is the war Canada was fighting hardest, the war of production, of shipbuilding, of the enormous homefront machine that fed the Allied war effort. Canada's place in the story of Guadalcanal sits in the same ledger that decided the campaign, the ledger of who could replace what they lost. It makes a less cinematic role than a Marine on a ridge, and yet, given how this campaign was truly won, it sits closer to the real reason for the victory. Which brings us back to where we began, to the claim in the title, and to the argument underneath it. Guadalcanal is routinely called the turning point of the Pacific War. After the island was secured, the leadership in the United States declared as much in public, announcing that the turning point of the war had at last been reached. A serious case supports it. The historian John Kuhn has argued directly against giving that title to the earlier Battle of Midway, and for giving it to Guadalcanal instead. The writer Joseph Whelan, in his account of the campaign, makes the same case. The argument runs like this, that Guadalcanal was the first real defeat inflicted on the Japanese army in the war, and the point at which the strategic initiative in the Pacific passed, permanently, from Japan to the United States. Before Guadalcanal, Japan was advancing. After Guadalcanal, Japan was retreating, and it never truly stopped. This is a documentary that does not smooth over a live disagreement. and the disagreement here is real. The traditional answer, when people name the turning point of the Pacific War, is not Guadalcanal but Midway, the carrier battle 2 months earlier that shattered Japanese naval airpower and, in the standard telling, stopped Japan's expansion cold. The two claims cannot both be the whole truth. A subtler position holds the two together, that Midway made Guadalcanal possible and Guadalcanal made the reversal permanent, that the victory in June opened the door, and the campaign running from August to February walked through it and shut it behind them. On this reading you do not have to choose. The turning point was not a moment but a season, running from the carriers at Midway through the exhaustion at Guadalcanal, and the two belong together. Then comes the hard counter-argument, the one that keeps the whole question open, because it turns on the very numbers we have just been through. If Guadalcanal was decisive because it broke the Japanese army, then consider this, that the 20-odd thousand Japanese who died on that island made up a tiny fraction of the Imperial Japanese Army, well under 1% of it. An army of millions did not have its back broken by the loss of a single reinforced division on one island. If Guadalcanal was decisive, the decisive attrition was not the soldiers dying in the jungle but the ships going down in the Sound and the trained aircrew burning out of the sky, the naval and air losses Japan could not replace, which points straight back toward the sea, and toward Midway, and toward the whole slow machinery of industrial replacement that no single battle can capture. There is even a wrinkle cutting against the tidy Midway story from the opposite direction. The neat version says that after Midway, Japan shifted to the defensive and ceded the initiative. Japan did not simply go quiet after Midway, though. It kept attacking, in the Solomons and in New Guinea, straight into 1942 and beyond. Guadalcanal itself is the proof, since a Japan that had truly gone on the defensive after June would not have spent 6 months and 20,000 lives trying to retake one airfield. The initiative did not cleanly pass in a single June afternoon. It stayed contested, violently, for another half a year in the waters and jungles of the Solomons, which is either an argument for Guadalcanal as the true turning point, or an argument that the whole idea of a single turning point is a story we tell after the fact to make a long, grinding, uncertain war feel as though it had a hinge. Here is what Guadalcanal was, stated plainly, with the comfortable version set aside. It was 6 months of fighting for one airfield on one malarial island, in which the Americans lost or drew a startling number of the battles and won the campaign regardless, because they could still put a ship in the water and a fed man in the line when their enemy could not. It was a fight the Japanese lost less to American heroism than to their own piecemeal commitment, to a supply line that could carry soldiers but not sustain them, and to the hunger that gave the island its Japanese name. It was a place where most of the American dead were sailors, not soldiers, and where most of the Japanese dead were not killed in battle at all. It was won, in the end, by a rate of replacement rather than a stroke of genius. Whether it was the turning point of the Pacific War, the single hinge of the whole conflict, remains an open question, honestly and permanently open, between the men who point to the carriers at Midway and the men who point to the exhaustion at Guadalcanal, and between both of them and the harder possibility that the war turned on no single hinge at all, only a long season of attrition in which one industrial power slowly, expensively, outlasted another. The wrecks are still down there in Iron Bottom Sound, more than 100 ships and 20,000 lives, mapped now by machines that descend into water the fighting men only ever saw the surface of. They do not settle the argument. They are the argument, the physical evidence that the tide of a war does not turn in a single moment, but is dragged, ship by ship and life by life, until it can no longer run the other way.